the 23rd of November, 1942. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Soviet armoured units converge at a crossing point in Kalach na Donu. At this precise instant, 250,000 Wehrmacht troops comprehend their encirclement. Yet the startling reality reveals this. Stalingrad's fate was sealed 4 days prior. Not amid the debris-filled boulevards capturing global attention, but through such cunning subterfuge that Germany's military leadership remained oblivious. We present Operation Uranus, a lightning 4-day campaign converting seeming Axis triumph into devastating encirclement. Stalingrad's genuine pivot wasn't the savage urban warfare filling our textbooks. Instead, it was remarkable Soviet misdirection exploiting German arrogance, permanently altering World War II's trajectory. Throughout 23 minutes, we'll explore how more than 1 million Red Army personnel gathered completely undetected, how they obliterated enemy positions across merely 96 hours, and how history's most formidable war machine was ambushed by opponents they dangerously dismissed. During mid-November 1942, German officers reviewing Stalingrad's devastation from command posts felt assured of conquest. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the Sixth Army, controlling the majority of territory lying westward from the Volga. The merciless building-by-building combat had weakened the Soviet 62nd Army to merely 47,000 personnel, 800 guns, and 19 armoured vehicles. Come the 11th of November, Wehrmacht troops had fragmented Russian defensive positions into 3 disconnected zones. What remained of the resistance clung to specific strategic locations, yet through German assessment, total collapse appeared imminent. Every battlefield metric indicated approaching Axis dominance. Luftwaffe aircraft ruled overhead. German cannons hammered surviving Red Army emplacements. Resupply routes, despite being overextended, appeared adequate for sustaining offensive pressure against contracting defensive pockets. The arithmetic of gradual elimination seemed to benefit the aggressors. Intelligence analysts within German ranks concluded the Soviets simply couldn't marshal adequate reinforcements for any substantial counterstrike. The Russians were hemorrhaging manpower throughout the wreckage. Complete capitulation seemed merely a question of timing. Such assurance wasn't simple optimism. It rested upon seemingly legitimate tactical achievements. Wehrmacht formations had seized manufacturing zones, transportation hubs, and civilian neighborhoods through relentless months of combat. They'd forced Russian defenders backward toward the Volga's very banks. Certain positions placed German machine guns fewer than 300 meters from the waterline. Another concentrated assault, leadership reasoned, would deliver total urban conquest. However, German Supreme Command committed a disastrous miscalculation. They grievously misjudged Soviet reserve capabilities and capacity for mounting large-scale operations. Intelligence reports discounted evidence of force accumulations as either deception tactics or insignificant troop supplements. Whenever airborne surveillance identified movement beyond Red Army positions, evaluators classified it as protective repositioning. The prospect of an enormous offensive fundamentally contradicted German beliefs regarding Soviet military potential. The Red Army, they maintained, remained too chaotic, too weakened, too technically backward for executing sophisticated strategic movements. Such excessive confidence generated a deadly oversight. The sectors flanking Stalingrad's northern and southern approaches were defended by inadequately supplied Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies. These German coalition partners spread thinly throughout hundreds of kilometers of frontage. Romania's Third Army, stationed northward from the city, deployed roughly 75,000 soldiers, equipped with antiquated Czech-manufactured armor and insufficient anti-armor weaponry. Romania's Fourth Army, positioned southward from Stalingrad, contained approximately 80,000 troops, facing comparable shortcomings. Italy's Eighth Army, alongside Hungary's Second Army, stationed farther north, proved even less prepared for extended engagement. Defensive formations across certain areas stretched to merely one soldier covering 4 meters. Anti-armor defenses depended chiefly upon 37mm and 47 mm weapons, armaments incapable of defeating Soviet T-34 protection. Local commanders understood these weaknesses. Romanian military leaders transmitted desperate communications to Wehrmacht headquarters, describing their deficient equipment and dangerously thin deployments. German coordination officers cautioned that these flanks couldn't survive concentrated assault. Such alerts were routinely ignored. German intelligence personnel, certain of Red Army inferiority, refused believing the Soviets possessed capacity for exploiting such vulnerabilities. Attention remained locked upon Stalingrad itself. Every German observer watched the burning cityscape. Every strategic assessment centered on the metropolitan struggle. Meanwhile, as German attention stayed riveted upon the city's smoking devastation, something extraordinary materialized just outside their awareness. An invisible military force emerging from nothing. Marshal Georgy Zhukov grasped something the Germans missed. Each day they invested pulverizing through Stalingrad's wreckage provided another opportunity for engineering their destruction. Through late September 1942, Zhukov, alongside General Alexander Vasilevsky, presented Stalin with an audacious plan. Cease channeling reserves into the urban slaughter. Rather, concentrate crushing force covertly and implement a dual encirclement, capturing the complete German Sixth Army. Stalin, showing initial doubt, greenlit the plan. What transpired became among warfare's most elaborate misdirection campaigns. Throughout late September until mid-November 1942, Soviet leadership orchestrated an extraordinary Maskirovka campaign. This terminology signifies battlefield deception, yet Operation Uranus transformed it into refined craftsmanship. The vicious city fighting throughout Stalingrad functioned as strategic camouflage. While global observers watched Red Army troops contest every structure, every level, every chamber, a concealed army gathered across the frozen steppes beyond Wehrmacht surveillance. This build-up's magnitude proved astounding. Throughout 6 weeks, Soviet forces covertly assembled 1,100,000 soldiers behind front lines. They gathered 1,400 tanks, incorporating 600 through 800 T-34s, the intermediate armor already demonstrating superiority against most German equipment. They emplaced exceeding 13,000 artillery, weapons within range of exposed Axis positions. They readied 1,100 warplanes for supporting the attack. This wasn't a disruption raid or restricted counter-thrust. This represented a force calculated for surrounding and destroying a complete German army. The Soviets achieved 2-to-1 personnel advantage against Axis troops throughout target zones. Their armor dominance proved even more absolute. Wehrmacht and Axis formations along the flanks fielded under 100 tanks, predominantly outdated variants. Soviet strategists had concentrated 14 times that quantity. Romanian forces manning vital defensive areas possessed anti-armor guns that Romanian crews would subsequently characterize as hurling pebbles against Soviet steel. How did the Soviets mask such tremendous strength? They enforced absolute wireless quiet, relying on messengers and hardwired communications. They transported personnel and material solely under darkness, concealing emplacements throughout daylight periods. They erected false concentrations, fabricated armored formations, and artillery positions calculated to mislead German overhead reconnaissance. They stationed actual forces within woodlands, depressions, and behind landscape characteristics blocking aerial detection. They synchronized final deployment with worsening meteorological circumstances that would ground German reconnaissance sorties. Most ingeniously, they exploited the metropolitan battle itself as misdirection. German leadership anticipated the Soviets would persist, funneling reserves into Stalingrad. Every Soviet counter-thrust within the city reinforced German assumptions that the Red Army remained fixated upon defending the ruins. German intelligence analysts interpreted the frantic urban combat as proof the Soviets possessed no reserves for offensive actions elsewhere. They observed the illusionist's decoy hand while his working hand prepared the revelation. Zhukov championed this massive counteroffensive over prolonged attrition. He recognized that exchanging losses throughout Stalingrad's rubble proved strategically fruitless. The metropolis had become symbolic, yet symbols don't determine conflicts. Operational encirclement determines conflicts. The dual envelopment design was straightforward, yet devastating. Two powerful mechanized thrusts would strike simultaneously northward and southward from Stalingrad, penetrating through vulnerable Axis sectors and converging westward from the city. The German Sixth Army, concentrated on metropolitan combat, would become imprisoned within a pocket backed against the Volga River. German aerial surveillance and intelligence completely missed detecting this enormous force concentration. Certain reconnaissance missions observed heightened activity beyond Soviet positions, but intelligence evaluators dismissed such findings as minor personnel rotations or deception measures. The possibility that exceeding 1 million Soviet troops stood prepared for attack simply didn't register. German assumptions regarding Soviet backwardness created a mental obstacle that facts couldn't overcome. They perceived what they anticipated perceiving, and they anticipated a shattered defensive opponent incapable of strategic action. Come the 18th of November, 1942, exceeding 1 million Soviet soldiers stood positioned in complete secrecy. Yet how would they convert this hidden strength into battlefield accomplishment? During the morning of the 19th of November, 1942, dense fog blanketed the frozen steppes, providing nature's final concealment for Soviet plans. The environment itself collaborated with Soviet misdirection, creating optimal surprise circumstances. Heavy fog alongside snow flurries covered the combat zones, substantially restricting German airborne reconnaissance potential. Luftwaffe aviators, grounded by virtually zero visibility, couldn't observe final Soviet arrangements. German intelligence's vision went dark at the crucial instant. Temperature measurements ranged from -10 through -20 Celsius. Troops throughout both armies suffered intense cold, yet the freezing circumstances generated an unanticipated tactical benefit for Soviet armor. The steppes, waterlogged and impassable throughout autumn precipitation, had solidified completely. Terrain that would have immobilized armor throughout October now provided highways for swift mechanized movement. Previously unusable ground transformed into approach corridors that Soviet strategists ruthlessly capitalized upon. The meteorological circumstances weren't merely neutral elements, they became amplifiers for Soviet subterfuge. The fog masked final repositioning of assault formations into launching areas. The snowfall dampened sounds from tank motors and artillery being staged. The cold diminished German patrol operations as sentries sheltered in bunkers instead of manning forward lookout positions. Every environmental characteristic aligned for preserving operational surprise until the attack instant. Soviet weather specialists had supplied predictions indicating such circumstances, and Soviet planners timed the assault correspondingly. German troops, lacking equivalent meteorological intelligence and convinced that major campaigns were unfeasible under such conditions, lowered their guard. The severe environment that Wehrmacht soldiers despised became a weapon within the Soviet armory. Nature selected allegiances at Stalingrad, choosing the Red Army. Romanian troops manning positions northward and southward from the city crouched in frigid earthworks. Their insufficient cold weather gear provided minimal defense against the piercing temperatures. Spirits deteriorated, machinery froze, communications infrastructure failed. Anti-armor weapons, already inadequate against Soviet armor, became increasingly unreliable under sub-zero temperatures. The Axis sectors, already vulnerable through design, became fragile in the cold. At sunrise on the 19th of November, through fog and precipitation, came sounds that would demolish German confidence permanently. The roar of 13,000 Soviet cannons. Romanian gunners fired frantically at advancing T-34s, observing with terror as their projectiles merely ricocheted off the armor like hurled stones. At 7:30 on the 19th of November, 1942, Operation Uranus's northern thrust burst into motion. Exceeding 3,500 Soviet guns commenced bombardment of Romania's Third Army emplacements northward from Stalingrad. The barrage continued 80 minutes. Romanian positions, already sparsely manned and weakly reinforced, dissolved under the bombardment. Communications disintegrated, leadership structures fractured, survivors wandered through smoke and snowfall, unable to mount organized opposition. Soviet 5th Tank Army alongside 21st Army surged ahead through demolished Romanian positions. T-34 armor, immune to Romanian anti-armor fire, advanced through defensive emplacements like steel tsunamis. Romanian after-action documentation captured the helplessness. Our projectiles bounced away as though we were throwing rocks. Romanian crews, courageous yet hopelessly overmatched, continued firing until Soviet armor crushed their positions beneath steel tracks. Within hours, Romania's Third Army ceased functioning as a coordinated combat formation. The southern thrust struck the following day. On the 20th of November, Soviet 51st and 57th Armies assaulted Romania's Fourth Army southward from Stalingrad. The pattern replicated: massive artillery bombardment, armored penetration, defensive collapse. Romanian troops stretched to one soldier covering 4 meters throughout certain zones couldn't contain the onslaught. Soviet armor penetrated deeply into Axis support regions, overrunning command posts, logistics centers, and artillery emplacements before defenders could respond. Soviet mechanized spearheads moved with remarkable velocity. They traversed up to 70 kilometers across 4 days, driving through Axis support zones and generating chaos throughout their advance. A Soviet armor commander subsequently characterized the penetration as resembling a tempest. Nothing could halt us. Every settlement we encountered, Axis personnel fled in disorder. The movement combined German blitzkrieg velocity with overwhelming Soviet industrial capacity. This wasn't the Red Army of 1941, disorganized and staggering from surprise invasion. This represented a force that had absorbed defeat's lessons and emerged revolutionized. Romanian losses throughout the initial days surpassed 50,000 killed, injured, or seized. Romania's Third and Fourth Armies, the formations tasked with securing the sectors, were effectively annihilated as fighting units. Survivors fled westward in confusion, discarding equipment and positions. German troops committed to metropolitan combat within Stalingrad couldn't redeploy sufficiently rapidly to seal the ruptures. The Soviet pincers drove deeper into Axis support zones with each successive hour. The 2 Soviet spearheads raced toward each other throughout the frozen landscape. Soviet 4th Tank Corps advanced northeast from the southern penetration. Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps drove southwest from the northern penetration. Their target was Kalach na Donu, a settlement 40 kilometers westward from Stalingrad, where a bridge spanned the Don River. Capture that crossing and the trap would seal. German headquarters began receiving incomplete disaster reports. Communications with Romanian formations ceased. Reconnaissance missions, when weather allowed, revealed Soviet armor deep within zones that should have constituted secure support territory. The catastrophe's magnitude gradually penetrated German awareness. This wasn't a localized counterthrust. This represented operational encirclement on tremendous scale. The double envelopment sealed a trap 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep, surrounding the complete German 6th Army. Exceeding 250,000 Wehrmacht soldiers focused on capturing Stalingrad's remaining sections suddenly confronted threats from behind. Soviet forces hadn't merely repelled the sectors, they'd penetrated through them, around them, and beyond them. The predators had become prey. As Soviet pincers raced toward convergence throughout the frozen landscape, one question dominated German headquarters. Could this genuinely be transpiring? Upon a bridge spanning the Don River, 2 columns of Soviet armor approached each other from opposing trajectories. The trap's jaws about to snap closed. Soviet 4th Tank Corps advancing northeast from the southern breakthrough reached Kalach na Donu's western periphery on the 22nd of November. Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps, advancing southwest from the northern breakthrough, approached from the opposite bearing. Between them stood the final opening in the encirclement. German troops at Kalach, a support zone garrison unprepared for frontline engagement, attempted defending the bridge. They were eliminated. Soviet armor rolled through the settlement, securing the vital crossing. At roughly 1600 hours on the 23rd of November, 1942, the two Soviet columns united at the bridge. Armor commanders dismounted. They embraced. A Soviet officer subsequently documented, "We embraced upon the bridge. Our pincers had sealed, and the Germans were imprisoned." That embrace determined the destiny of 250,000 personnel. At that instant, the complete German 6th Army discovered itself surrounded within a pocket possessing inadequate provisions, no evacuation strategy, and supreme command that refused acknowledging the circumstances' reality. The encirclement was finalized, within merely 4 days from the initial assault, 4 days converting apparent German triumph into catastrophic defeat, 4 days demonstrating that Soviet operational expertise had progressed beyond German understanding. The convergence at Kalach represented the culmination of months of preparation and subterfuge. Every nocturnal movement that transported personnel undetected, every wireless silence directive that masked Soviet plans, every diversionary assault within Stalingrad that anchored German focus on the metropolitan struggle, every intelligence lapse that permitted German leadership to remain oblivious to the gathering storm. Everything converged at that bridge, in that embrace, at that moment. The symbolism wasn't overlooked by Soviet commanders. The Kalach Bridge became a testament to operational achievement. Images of Soviet tankers meeting at the crossing circulated throughout Red Army formations, evidence that German invincibility was mythology. The encirclement proved that the Wehrmacht could be outflanked, outwitted, and trapped by opponents they'd dismissed as inferior. German troops inside the pocket initially didn't comprehend the disaster's scale. Numerous formations continued offensive actions within Stalingrad, unaware their supply corridors had been severed. Communications remained disordered. Incomplete breakthrough reports competed with directives to persist attacks on Soviet emplacements within the city. The dissonance between orders and circumstances generated paralysis. Certain commanders continued implementing plans for final assaults on Soviet defenders, even as Soviet armor sealed the encirclement behind them. The pocket measured roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. It contained not solely combat formations, but additionally supply elements, administrative staff, Luftwaffe ground personnel, and various support organizations. The total quantity imprisoned exceeded 250,000 personnel. They possessed restricted ammunition reserves, inadequate winter apparel, and provisions calculated for mobile offense, not static encirclement. The pocket possessed no defensible boundary, no constructed fortifications, and no unified defensive strategy. 250,000 Wehrmacht soldiers now discovered themselves within a pocket 50 kilometers wide. Yet did they comprehend the catastrophe's magnitude that had overtaken them? General Schmidt, Paulus's staff chief, sat in shocked silence before documenting words capturing the inconceivable. Never throughout my existence did I anticipate such catastrophe. His journal notation from the 23rd of November, 1942, expressed the psychological trauma that immobilized German leadership. The transition from assurance to existential terror happened not progressively, but instantaneously. One instant triumph seemed certain. The following instant, the complete army confronted annihilation. General Friedrich Paulus understood the disaster immediately. He grasped that his army, designed for mobile offensive campaigns, was imprisoned within an indefensible pocket possessing inadequate provisions. He grasped that Soviet troops now controlled the initiative. He grasped that every passing hour diminished the escape possibility. On the 23rd of November, he requested authorization from Hitler for attempting a breakout toward German positions westward. The request was refused. Hitler's response was categorical. All emplacements must be maintained to the final soldier and final cartridge. No withdrawal, no breakout. The Sixth Army would hold position and await rescue. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, pledged to provision the surrounded army through aircraft. He assured delivery of 500 tons of provisions daily, the minimum necessary for sustaining combat capability. This pledge was militarily unachievable, as Luftwaffe logistics personnel immediately recognized, yet it provided Hitler justification for forbidding retreat. Military opinion among German commanders maintained that escape remained feasible between the 23rd and 25th of November if breakout was authorized promptly. The Soviet encirclement, though closed, remained tenuous across numerous sectors. Soviet troops, having progressed 70 kilometers across 4 days, were overextended and susceptible to concentrated counterattack. A resolute breakout, sacrificing heavy machinery but preserving the army's personnel, could have penetrated Soviet positions and reached German emplacements westward. Multiple staff personnel urged Paulus to contravene Hitler's directives and break out on his personal authority. Paulus refused. A product of Prussian military tradition, he wouldn't contravene explicit orders from the Supreme Commander. His staff chief, General Schmidt, reinforced this determination, contending that unauthorized withdrawal would result in court-martial and humiliation. The escape window, limited initially, narrowed hour by hour as Soviet troops reinforced the encirclement boundary. Come the 26th of November, breakout had become substantially more challenging. Come December, it had become virtually unfeasible. Hitler's refusal authorizing breakout wasn't merely tactical miscalculation. It reflected ideological stubbornness that prioritized symbolic triumph above military pragmatism. Stalingrad bore Stalin's designation. Retreating from Stalingrad meant acknowledging defeat in a struggle that had become personally identified with the Führer himself. Hitler's pride, his refusal, acknowledging miscalculation, and his misguided confidence in Göring's unfeasible pledges converted encirclement into extermination. The psychological deterioration within German leadership was immediate and complete. Officers who had confidently strategized the final assault on Soviet emplacements now confronted the reality that they themselves were besieged. The key predator-prey dynamic had inverted. Troops who had battled for months capturing Stalingrad now battled for survival within sight of the metropolis they'd failed seizing. Diary notations and correspondence from the pocket reflect this transition from assurance to hopelessness, from certainty of triumph to acknowledgement of doom. General Schmidt's journal notation captured the moment's essence. We are surrounded. No connection with external territory. The isolation was not solely physical, but psychological. The Sixth Army, the vanguard of German advance into the Soviet Union, now stood isolated within a frozen pocket, encircled by opponents they had dangerously misjudged. The question haunting every staff gathering, every command conference was straightforward, yet unanswerable. How had this occurred? As the escape window sealed, one question troubled every imprisoned Wehrmacht soldier. How had they been so thoroughly blindsided? The most potent weapon within Operation Uranus wasn't the T-34 armor or Soviet numerical dominance. It was German hubris. The Stalingrad encirclement resulted not from Soviet tactical excellence in engagement, but from disastrous German intelligence lapses and systematic dismissal of opponent capabilities. The Germans weren't outbattled. They were outsmarted. German intelligence completely missed detecting the Soviet concentration of 1,100,000 personnel, despite airborne surveillance and signals monitoring. Reconnaissance missions observed increased movement beyond Soviet positions, yet intelligence personnel dismissed such observations as defensive arrangements or misdirection. The prospect that the Red Army could concentrate such crushing force covertly simply didn't match German beliefs regarding Soviet organizational capability. Intelligence evaluators perceived what they anticipated perceiving and filtered out conflicting data. Frontline commanders' alerts regarding vulnerable sectors were systematically dismissed by German Supreme Command. Romanian liaison personnel reported inadequate anti-armor protection and dangerously extended defensive formations. German officers assigned to coalition allied formations transmitted urgent appeals for reinforcement and superior equipment. Such alerts reached headquarters, yet were characterized as alarmist or self-interested. High Command believed that Axis Allied troops, though inferior to Wehrmacht formations, were adequate for maintaining defensive emplacements against opponents presumed incapable of major offensive campaigns. Excessive confidence in Soviet backwardness generated a deadly strategic oversight that prevented appropriate threat evaluation. German military culture, constructed upon victories throughout Poland, France, and Operation Barbarossa's initial months, had absorbed beliefs regarding Slavic racial inferiority and communist military incompetence. Such ideological beliefs functioned as mental filters, preventing German leadership from acknowledging evidence of Soviet operational refinement. The Red Army of late 1942 resembled nothing like the Red Army of 1941, yet German intelligence continued evaluating Soviet potential through the perspective of obsolete beliefs. Misguided confidence in Luftwaffe aerial resupply potential led to breakout rejection when escape remained feasible. Göring's pledge to provision the surrounded army through aircraft was founded upon delusion, not logistics. The Luftwaffe possessed neither adequate transport aircraft nor sufficient airfields for delivering 500 tons of provisions daily to the pocket. Meteorological circumstances, Soviet anti-aircraft protection, and the separation from German airfields to the encirclement rendered sustained aerial provision unfeasible. Luftwaffe logistics personnel understood this, yet Göring's political leverage and Hitler's requirement for justification forbidding withdrawal superseded military pragmatism. Historians now acknowledge intelligence lapse and excessive confidence as determining elements, not metropolitan combat. David Glantz, alongside other Eastern Front researchers, emphasized that Operation Uranus, not the boulevard combat within Stalingrad, determined the engagement's result. The vicious urban warfare dominating popular accounts was strategically meaningless. Once the encirclement sealed, German troops inside the pocket could have dominated every structure within Stalingrad, and it wouldn't have altered their destiny. The determining action transpired not within the wreckage, but along the sectors, not through tactical engagement, but through operational movement. The encirclement revealed fundamental weaknesses in German coalition operations. Dependence upon inadequately supplied Axis partners for maintaining vital zones generated vulnerabilities that Soviet strategists exploited mercilessly. German leadership placed minimal confidence in Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops, yet assigned them defensive duties without supplying sufficient equipment or reinforcement. This mixture of disdain and reliance proved deadly. The weakest connections within the German defensive structure fractured first, and the complete architecture collapsed. On the 24th of January, 1943, as Soviet troops constricted the noose surrounding the contracting pocket, Paulus transmitted a final evaluation to Supreme Command. The front is shattered. Additional resistance is meaningless. Disaster is unavoidable. This communication, transmitted 2 months following the encirclement's closure, acknowledged what had been accurate since the 23rd of November. The engagement was determined the instant the trap sealed. Everything following was merely the slow-motion disintegration of an army that had been strategically vanquished across 4 days. History recalls Stalingrad for marksmen throughout wreckage and close-quarters combat within frozen manufacturing facilities. Yet this recollection obscures the engagement's genuine instruction. The determining instant came not throughout the debris-filled boulevards, but throughout the frozen steppes beyond German observation. The pivot was not tactical, but operational. Not attrition, but encirclement. Not endurance, but subterfuge. Operation Uranus proved Soviet capacity for implementing sophisticated misdirection and operational movement at strategic magnitude. The concentration of exceeding 1 million personnel in complete secrecy. The synchronization of simultaneous assaults throughout hundreds of kilometers of frontage. The swift capitalization of breakthroughs through mechanized spearheads. The encirclement's closure across merely 4 days. These accomplishments demonstrated a Red Army revolutionized from the chaotic force of 1941 into a refined military apparatus capable of defeating the Wehrmacht at its own discipline. the four-day encirclement campaign, accomplished what months of metropolitan combat couldn't: the obliteration of a complete German army. Soviet defenders within Stalingrad battled with remarkable bravery and determination, yet their opposition alone couldn't have vanquished the Sixth Army. The metropolitan struggle anchored German focus and consumed German assets, yet it didn't establish the strategic result. Operation Uranus established the strategic result. The boulevard combat was the diversion. The encirclement was the execution. Operation Uranus's narrative answers our question conclusively. Stalingrad's pivot came not from the savage boulevard warfare dominating popular consciousness, but from a remarkable four-day Soviet misdirection campaign that capitalized on disastrous German intelligence lapses and arrogance. Throughout the 19th through 23rd of November 1942, while global observers watched the metropolitan struggle, Soviet troops implemented a masterful double envelopment that surrounded 250,000 Wehrmacht personnel through operational excellence that German leadership never foresaw. General Schmidt's journal notation captures the fundamental truth. Never throughout my existence did I anticipate such catastrophe. Germany forfeited Stalingrad not because they were defeated throughout the wreckage, but because they were strategically sightless to the concealed army concentrating within the fog. The Wehrmacht, assured of its superiority and contemptuous of Soviet potential, failed detecting the supreme threat until it manifested as crushing force. Intelligence lapses, ideological beliefs, and systematic dismissal of opponents generated vulnerabilities that Soviet strategists capitalized upon with devastating precision. Stalingrad's genuine instruction isn't regarding endurance or savagery, but regarding the deadly price of underestimating opponents and confusing tactical concentration for strategic perception. Across 4 days, the Soviets converted apparent German triumph into encirclement, demonstrating that warfare's genuine craft lies not within the combat everyone observes, but within the preparation nobody detects until far too late. If this narrative engaged you, subscribe for additional World War II historical analyses weekly. Thanks for watching.